Hey everyone. Okay, now that you've finished watching the oversimplified video about World War II, I want to point out some pretty important information that you will need to remember and consider as we go throughout the unit. So, they did talk about how Hitler had allies in Italy and Japan, and they had their own goals, but Hitler's own goals were always at the forefront of his mind, and would lead to his big plan, which he called the final solution, which we'll learn about in a minute. But I really want you to take note of his two main goals. So the first was to create a superior race known as the Aryan nation. I do spell it a little weird here because Schoology does see it as a bad word. So normally you wouldn't have the stars in between it, but it was called the Aryan Nation. And basically, that was a group of people that would be tall, blonde hair, blue eyed, and of German descent. Now, it is a little ironic considering that Hitler himself was a very short, pudgy, ugly man with black hair, but and brown eyes, from what I understand. But that was his goal. He wanted to create this like superior race of German people that would just kind of take over everything. And to be able to do that, he thought that he had to eliminate inferior races or what he considered inferior races. And so, what he does is he takes upon this whole plan of convincing the German people that all of their suffering stems from these groups of inferior races. And so, they needed to be eliminated. And by eliminating them, then they could also achieve the goal of creating more room for this Aryan race to live in. And they'd have more resources and things because all these groups would be gone. And so that's what leads us into the Holocaust, which I consider a time of evil, one of the real life dystopias of the Holocaust. So, as we're going through this, I do want you to keep in mind the things that we did learn about dystopias, what it entails, what kind there are, because at the end you will have an assignment that you have to do that synthesizes that information or combines that information with what you're going to learn today. I do want you to be taking notes as we're going through this and notating some pretty key events, and I will highlight what I want you to highlight verbally, at least, what I want you to take note of. But again, remember your notes are for you, not for me. It's to help you remember. Okay? So, the real reason I want to give you all this background is because you do have to have a good level of understanding of what led up to this atrocious event known as the Holocaust, because we're going to be going and analyzing it pretty in depth in this unit. We're going to be looking at some texts that are well known about the Holocaust, such as Night, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and Mouse 2. We'll be looking at some movie scenes that depict situations during the Holocaust and right after. We'll be looking at some poems that really get into the feeling of what it was like to live in the Holocaust. And then we're going to look at some articles that address the promise that arises after the Holocaust, known as Never Again. And I will definitely be giving you some more in depth information on what that promise is, and we'll consider if we're really upholding that promise towards the end of the unit. So, again, since we're going to be reading so many things and looking very closely at texts that deal with the Holocaust, it is very important that you have a good foundational knowledge of not just World War II, but also the things that were happening with the Holocaust. So again, take notes. This is going to be really important. And then I will go over it again a little bit tomorrow. So, the Holocaust, I do consider it again a time of evil. I also do consider it a real life dystopia. And again, as we're going through, I want you to be thinking about what dystopias were, what kind they were, and why would I consider the Holocaust to be one. So, as the oversimplified video stated, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler and his army invade Poland. Now, Poland is a very key player within the war. This is where most of the concentration camps do pop up. A lot of people think that it's actually within Germany that there's concentration camps, but in reality, most of them are in Poland, because this is where he really starts to implement his goals and his plans. So even though he does invade on September 1st, 1931, France and Britain really don't declare war until September 3rd, 1939, which kicks off World War II. But at that time, it's really not the whole world that's involved. It is Hitler and his allies in Italy and Japan, and France and Britain. Um, if you want to see more about that and then how that war starts to play out, you can go back and watch the rest of the oversimplified video. It's actually really interesting how some key players start to come in. But I do want you to definitely understand that it is the invasion of Poland that really sets the war in motion. So, before we dive into how the invasion of Poland not only sets off the war, but also the Holocaust, you need to understand what the term Holocaust means. Now, this word is an old word. It actually was not tied to the war, it had a whole different meaning before it. So, its traditional term, or the traditional use of the term, came from a Greek origin, which was holos, which is whole, and kostos, which means burned. So it was used to describe sacrificial offerings burned at an altar. So it was actually a religious term. It was a sacrifice. But this gets turned on its head in 1945. And again, this is a really important part right here that I want you to know. It is in 1945 that this term, the Holocaust, becomes used to define the ideological and systematic state sponsored persecution and mass murder of millions of European Jews and other marginalized groups. Now, again, you don't have to write that word for word. What I need you to remember is in 1945, the term Holocaust begins to be used for the mass murder of Jews by Nazi Germany. Now, it is very important that you clarify that it is Nazi Germany, not just Germans, because it was Nazi Germany at that point. So, again, 1945, the term Holocaust begins to be used to describe the mass murder of Jews by Nazi Germany. Okay, so again, that's pretty important. Now, the beginning of the Holocaust, again, starts in Poland. And it's really in Poland where Hitler kind of kicks all his plans into motion. And what he does is he forces thousands of Jews out of their homes and into what we call ghettos. Now, we've all heard the term ghetto before, but in Nazi Germany, ghettos are more like neighborhoods that are surrounded by barbed wire, in which he forces all the Jews into this like couple blocks of neighborhood that is barbed wired in and patrolled by German forces. And the Jews could not leave. They were all stuck there, very, very cramped, very crowded. Sometimes there'd be whole families in a one bedroom apartment or room with multiple families because they were all just crammed in there. So they were uprooted from their homes. They were not given a lot of time to take their possessions and just forced into this very tight area that was very hard to live in. There was not a lot of resources, and they were constantly surveillanced and controlled. Another way that the Nazi Germany began to control the people or to kind of monitor them is they forced them in 1941 of September. So September 1941, that's an important date. They are required to start wearing the Star of David. Now, the Star of David was not just on their clothing, it had to be on their businesses as well, like in the windows. They had to be identifiable, okay? And this was in case if they left the ghettos, they were easily identified. And this is kind of a twofold thing. So not only did it help them be more patrolled and monitored, but it also led to the attacking of a lot of Jews because they were easily identified. Since their businesses were easily identified, there was a lot of vandalism. They would destroy the businesses. It was an easy way to target these people. They could not hide. They had to have these on their clothing and in the windows at all time, where they lived, where they worked. The Star of David was like a big "Here I am" sign. So the event horizon is called the final solution, and this is Hitler's big plan. I want you to notate that. The final solution was Hitler's master plan. An event horizon is a point of no return. So also remember that. An event horizon is a point of no return. So this is where the Holocaust kind of hits that moment where there's no going back. Hitler is steaming full charge ahead, and he has no intention of backing off of this plan. And it occurs late in 1941. So the Jews and other marginalized groups are transported from the ghettos to concentration camps. And we're going to see periods of this in some of the dramas that we look at. We're going to see what it was actually like for these people to be gathered out of the ghettos. It was pretty traumatic. They had no warning. They pretty much came in and said, gather your things, you're leaving. They were not told where they were going, and they were packed into these cattle trains. Talk about what it was like for them to be herded into these cattle trains and forced to be transported this way through some of the texts that we read, and kind of discuss what that must have been like. So another thing that I really want you to notate is, even though when we think of the Holocaust, we think of Jews and that it did happen to the Jews, and the Jews did lose many, many, many people, it was not just the Jews that Hitler targeted. Again, remember, he was trying to get rid of all inferior races, and he felt that the Roma gypsies, the Polish civilians, Serbian civilians, people with disabilities, Russian civilians, and Jehovah Witnesses were also part of that group, and so they were also rounded up and taken to the concentration camps, and they suffered mass casualties. We'll see at the end how many people these groups actually did lose. So the concentration camps themselves were places where people went to die, and I want to make that very clear. You had two options: you either died right away, or you pretty much died later. So the first instance where you died right away, it was due to gas chambers, which is pictured up here, and chemical showers, and then the incinerators. So what would happen is you were sorted, and we're going to take a look at that, how the sorting happens. We're going to actually do a virtual tour of a concentration camp and read an excerpt that talks about the sorting. But if you were sorted into the group that was meant to die immediately, you were told to strip of all your clothing, and you were put in these chambers, and they either pumped in gas or chemicals that would kill you, and they would cram people in there. And then they had to do something with all the bodies, and what they would do is they would put them in what was called the chimneys, which are here, the incinerators, and they would burn the bodies. And we will again see some images of what these chimneys and incinerators look like. And there's actual instances where so many bodies were being burned and so much smoke and ash was poured into the air that people thought it was like snow almost that was falling on them, but it was actually human ash. And these are what would happen is, so they would tell you, take off your glasses, take off your shoes. So this is just kind of an indication of how many people were funneled through these gas chambers and chemical showers and lost their lives. So the second option, you did live. You weren't killed immediately, but it was hell on earth. It was very much a struggle to live, and they suffered horrendously. They were starved, tortured, experimented on. There is a particular doctor named Dr. Mengele who used to like to experiment on the Jews as if they were lab rats, and he did all these experiments that were just absolutely mind-blowingly atrocious. It was horrible. They suffered a great deal. It was very packed and cramped. They were horrible living conditions, and when the war actually ended, the way that the people were found, the soldiers couldn't believe it. It was just really, really bad. And so again, we're going to be reading some text and looking at some clips that really show what this was like. So the beginning of the end, Germany does fall on April 30th, 1945, when Hitler commits suicide. Again, if you want to know a little bit more about what happens, there's a whole bunch of documentaries that you can go look at that talks about how Germany's strength starts to fall, um, along with his allies. It's pretty interesting. But he does commit suicide, but Germany itself does not actually declare that it surrenders until May 8th, 1945. Um, so that's about a 3 yearish span of the Holocaust. And that doesn't seem like a very long time, but if you're enduring the Holocaust, if you're enduring all these atrocities, it really just did not come soon enough. And so there's no definitive number, but experts state that approximately 6 million Jews, plus an additional 8 million other marginalized people, were killed during the Holocaust. So that's a combined total of about 14 million people that died in this 3 year span. And I am not talking about, oh, they were soldiers that were fighting the war or just casualties that died in a bombing. No, this was specifically due to the final solution plan of Hitler through the concentration camps, 14 million people. And that is just insane to think about. Um, if we think about our school right now, there's only 1,700 ish of you guys in the school right now. And so take that, times it almost by 7, and you'll kind of get the idea of how many people were actually killed through the Holocaust. And so, as we're going through this unit, it's going to be a little rough. Sometimes there's going to be some really raw and atrocious things that we read or watch these people endure, but it's really important, and we'll talk about why it's important that we remember and then consider the promise of never again. Once the war was over, the world realized the blind eye that had been turned to the situation and why it could never again happen. And that's where the promise of never again pops up. And we will talk about that and discuss it and see if we're actually honoring that as we go forward with the unit. So, all right, this probably took up most of the class period, so I'm pretty sure most of you will not finish the assignment by the end of class. If not, I will go ahead and extend the due date. But I want you to go explain the why. Why was the Holocaust considered a dystopia? And in that, it's a short response. I want you to tell me, why was the Holocaust a dystopia? What kind of dystopia it was? And I want you to really put some thought into it. I am looking more for thought, no, not so much grammar and spelling, though I do ask that you try to do good on those. But again, it's more thought. I want you to think critically about what you've learned today and why it might be a dystopia. And think about what the goal of a dystopia is versus what was the goal of Hitler. If you have any questions, just let me know. I really do recommend that you go watch the whole oversimplified video about World War II and learn a little bit more about World War II. It's really interesting. And we'll talk more about it tomorrow.